A black teen pays for a Hell's Angels gas, with the last $20 he has to his name. He thinks it's just a small act of kindness, one that no one will ever notice. But the next morning, the quiet little town starts to shake. 300 roaring motorcycles pull in, their engines like thunder, their jackets marked with skulls. The boys' neighbors think trouble's come to town. The sheriff's ready to draw a line. But what if these men aren't here for revenge, but for redemption? As old fears clash with new faith, kindness sparks a wildfire no one saw coming. And when the town turns against him, the boy faces the hardest question of all. Can one act of kindness really change 300 hardened hearts, and maybe even save his own? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered gas station, its faded paint and rusty signs telling stories of better days. Trey Johnson's fingers were cramped from hours of restocking shelves and working the register, but he kept wiping the counter in steady circles, trying to make the old surface shine. His worn sneakers, held together with duct tape on one side, squeaked against the linoleum floor as he moved. $20. That's what remained in his pocket after a week of double shifts. 20 precious dollars that would buy his mama's medicine. Nothing more, nothing less. His boss still hadn't given him last week's paycheck, muttering excuses about cash flow and late deliveries. Trey didn't argue, couldn't afford to, even though the unpaid bills kept piling up at home. The rumble started as a distant growl, growing louder until it filled the air like approaching thunder. Trey looked up to see a group of motorcycles rolling into the station, chrome glinting despite the gray November sky. Their leather-clad riders moved with the easy confidence of men who commanded respect wherever they went. One rider, older than the rest, caught Trey's attention. Deep lines carved valleys in his weathered face, and tattoos wound their way up his neck like twisted vines. His gray-streaked beard couldn't hide the hard set of his jaw as he tried repeatedly to pay at the pump. Trey watched through the window as frustration bloomed on the man's face. "Damn it all," the biker muttered, loud enough for Trey to hear through the glass. The card reader's red light blinked mockingly, rejection after rejection. Without really thinking about it, Trey's feet carried him outside. The November wind bit through his thin uniform shirt, but he barely noticed. The biker turned, tensing slightly at Trey's approach. Up close, Trey could see the name Bull stitched on his leather vest. "Everything okay, sir?" Trey asked, his voice soft but steady. "Card's acting up," Bull growled, though Trey sensed the anger wasn't directed at him. "Been on the road 3 days. Must have tripped some security flag." Trey's hand moved to his pocket, fingers brushing against the worn $20 bill, his mama's medicine money. He thought about her cough, getting worse as winter approached. Thought about the way she never complained, just kept thanking God for their blessings, even when the blessings seemed mighty hard to find. "I can help," Trey said, pulling out the 20. "Please, let me take care of it." Bull's eyes, sharp and blue as winter sky, fixed on Trey's face. "Kid, I don't take charity." Trey managed a small smile. "It's not charity, sir. Just kindness. My mama says it always comes back somehow." Something flickered in Bull's expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of something long forgotten. He stood there, this imposing figure in well-worn leather, staring at the skinny teenager in a faded uniform shirt, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, Bull accepted the money with calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work and harder living. "What's your name, son?" "Trey Johnson, sir." The old church bell across the street chose that moment to ring out, its deep tones echoing across the nearly empty parking lot. Bull glanced at it, then back at Trey, something unreadable in his expression. "Hank Marston," he said gruffly, "though most folks call me Bull." He hesitated, then added, "You're either the smartest kid I've met or the dumbest, can't decide which." Trey's smile widened slightly. "My mama would probably say both, sir." Bull nodded slowly, his eyes still studying Trey's face, as if searching for something. Then he turned, filled his tank, and swung back onto his motorcycle. The engine roared to life, and soon Bull and his fellow riders were disappearing down Highway 23, swallowed by the gathering dusk. Later that night, Trey lay in his narrow bed, listening to the rain tap dancing on their trailer's tin roof. Through the thin walls, he could hear his mother's cough, the same cough that had been getting steadily worse since summer turned to fall. Her quiet prayers drifted through the darkness, thanking God for their blessings, asking him to watch over her boy. Trey stared at the water stains on the ceiling, his mama's words from years ago echoing in his mind. "Kindness always comes back, baby. Maybe not how we expect, maybe not when we want, but it always comes back." He whispered the words to himself now, trying to believe them, wondering if they were true. The $20 that should have gone to her medicine was gone, spent on a stranger's gas. But something in Bull's eyes, that moment of recognition, of something awakening, kept playing in Trey's mind as the rain fell steadily outside. The next morning, Trey woke to a deep rumble that made the windows of their small trailer rattle. At first he thought it might be thunder, but the sound was different, mechanical, and growing louder by the second. His mother's worried voice called from the living room. "Trey, you hearing this?" He scrambled out of bed, still in his worn pajama pants and faded t-shirt, just as his mother pulled back the thin curtain. She clutched her threadbare robe tight around her shoulders, her face pale in the early morning light. "Good Lord," she whispered. The ground beneath them trembled as motorcycle after motorcycle poured into their quiet town. They came in waves, tens, then dozens, then hundreds. Their chrome pipes glinted in the morning sun, and their engines created a symphony that echoed off the buildings of their usually sleepy Main Street. "I'm counting at least 300 of them," his mother said, her voice shaking slightly. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to suppress a cough. The sharp wail of a siren cut through the thunderous roar as Sheriff Lacey's patrol car went flying past their trailer, lights flashing. 2 more police cars followed close behind. "Mama, I think I know what this is about," Trey said, his heart pounding. "Remember that biker from yesterday? The one I told you about?" Before she could answer, Trey was pulling on his jeans and shoes. "Baby, wait," she called after him, but he was already out the door, running toward the gas station where he worked. The scene that greeted him was unlike anything their town had ever seen. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Reporters clutched microphones, their camera operators jostling for position. In the center of it all stood Bull, his massive frame impossible to miss among the crowd. Sheriff Lacey stood off to the side, his hand resting nervously on his gun belt as he watched the scene unfold. His face was a mask of barely contained anxiety as he spoke into his radio. Trey tried to hang back, to blend into the gathering crowd of townspeople, but Bull's eyes found him immediately. The older man lifted his helmet, and a hush fell over the crowd. "That kid right there," Bull declared, his voice thick with emotion as he pointed at Trey. "He paid for my gas when I couldn't. When my card got declined, he didn't hesitate, didn't judge, just helped." Bull's voice cracked slightly. "He made me believe in good again." The assembled bikers raised their voices in a cheer that seemed to shake the very ground. Engines revved in unison, a thunderous salute that made the windows of nearby buildings rattle in their frames. Reporter Jenna Cross from Channel 7 pushed forward with her microphone. "Sir, are you saying all these riders came here because of one act of kindness?" "Word spreads fast in our community," Bull answered. "When I told my brothers what this boy did, they wanted to come thank him themselves, show him what kindness can do." The townspeople who had gathered stood frozen, uncertain whether to applaud or retreat. Some cast nervous glances at the sheriff, while others whispered among themselves, pointing at Trey. Throughout the day, the crowd only grew. News crews set up their equipment in the gas station parking lot, and social media buzzed with posts about the small Arkansas town that had attracted hundreds of bikers through one simple act of kindness. By late afternoon, Trey's mother was beside herself with worry. "Please," she begged him as he sat at their small kitchen table. "Just stay home tonight. This is too much attention." Her words were interrupted by a coughing fit that made Trey's chest ache with guilt over the $20 he'd given away. But before he could respond, there was a knock at their door, a sound that seemed to echo through their tiny trailer. Through the window, they could see dozens of headlights illuminating their front yard. Trey opened the door to find Bull standing there, flanked by several other riders. Their arms were loaded with grocery bags, and behind them, other bikers were unloading gas cans from their saddlebags. "Ma'am," Bull said, nodding respectfully to Trey's mother. "We hope you don't mind, but we wanted to return your boy's kindness." He gestured to the supplies. "It's not much, but it's a start." Trey stood awkwardly in the doorway, overwhelmed by the attention and unsure how to respond to such generosity. His mother's eyes filled with tears as she watched the bikers carefully arrange their gifts on the small porch. "I don't know what to say," Trey managed finally. Bull placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You said enough yesterday, kid. Now it's our turn." As night fell, Main Street remained alive with activity. Headlights created rivers of light through the darkness, and the low rumble of idling engines provided a constant backdrop to the conversations and laughter that filled the evening air. Trey sat on his front porch steps, watching it all unfold. Around him, bikers mingled with townspeople, sharing stories and coffee from the diner down the street. Even Sheriff Lacey had relaxed somewhat, though he still kept a watchful eye on the proceedings. The evening wrapped up with Bull and his crew parked along their street, their presence both protective and celebratory. Trey's mother had finally stopped protesting and was sharing her homemade cookies with anyone who came near, her earlier fear replaced by cautious wonder. As Trey looked out at the glowing headlights that lined Main Street, he felt something shift in the air, a change in the rhythm of their small town, a new energy that hummed alongside the motorcycle engines. His simple act of kindness had sparked something none of them quite understood yet, but its warmth could be felt by everyone present. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Johnsons' worn front porch as Sheriff Walter Lacey's patrol car pulled up, gravel crunching under its tires. Through the thin curtains, Trey watched the sheriff adjust his hat before making his way to their door, each step measured and deliberate. Mrs. Johnson smoothed her dress with trembling hands before opening the door. "Sheriff Lacey, what brings you by so early?" The sheriff stood with his hat clutched against his chest, but his polite gesture couldn't mask the coldness in his eyes. "Mrs. Johnson, Trey?" He nodded to each of them. "Mind if I come in for a moment?" They settled in the small living room, the sheriff perching uncomfortably on their faded floral armchair. The ticking of the wall clock seemed unusually loud in the tense silence. "I'll be direct," Sheriff Lacey began, his fingers drumming against his hat brim. "These bikers, they're unsettling folks. We've got concerned citizens calling non-stop about safety, property values, the whole 9 yards. Trey leaned forward in his seat. "But Sheriff, they haven't caused any trouble. They're just being kind." "Kind?" The sheriff's laugh held no humor. "Kind men don't wear skull patches, son. I've seen their type before. Nothing good comes from mixing with their sort." Mrs. Johnson's sudden coughing fit interrupted the conversation. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, her thin shoulders shaking with each raspy breath. The sheriff's expression softened slightly, but his stance remained firm. "Just keep your distance," he advised, standing to leave. "For everyone's sake." The screen door had barely stopped swinging behind the sheriff when the distinctive rumble of motorcycles approached. Bull's massive frame filled the doorway as he knocked, flanked by several other riders whose leather vests gleamed in the morning light. Mrs. Johnson, still recovering from her coughing spell, managed a warm smile. "Would you gentlemen like some coffee?" Soon, their small kitchen table hosted an unlikely gathering. Bull's massive hands dwarfed the delicate coffee cup as he watched Mrs. Johnson move carefully around the kitchen. Another coughing fit seized her, and she gripped the counter for support. "Ma'am," Bull said quietly, his gravelly voice gentler than before. "How long you been sick?" The question hung in the air. Mrs. Johnson's eyes met Trey's before she sank into a chair. "About 2 years now," she admitted. "The treatments help when we can afford them." Bull's weathered face remained neutral, but his eyes tracked every detail. The stack of unopened mail by the phone, the medicine bottles lined up on the windowsill, the careful way Mrs. Johnson measured out her coffee grounds to make them last. "Bill's rough?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Trey stared down at his coffee. "The hospital wants payment for the last 3 treatments, and the bank—" He trailed off, unable to say the word foreclosure out loud. Something shifted in Bull's expression, a hardening of his jaw, a flash of determination in his eyes. He shared a look with his companions, silent understanding passing between them. Later that afternoon, the bikers began setting up camp in an empty field just outside town. Tents sprouted like mushrooms across the landscape, and the smell of campfire smoke drifted on the breeze. "We'll stay a few days," Bull announced, his voice carrying across the makeshift camp. "Do some good while we're here." Word spread quickly through the small town. At the diner, patrons huddled over coffee cups, whispering their concerns. Outside the grocery store, mothers pulled their children closer when leather-clad figures passed by. Even the church ladies, usually quick to organize help for those in need, kept their distance. Trey found himself walking an invisible line between 2 worlds. At home, his mother's quiet prayers and gentle reminders to trust in God's plan filled the evening air. At the bikers' camp, rough laughter and colorful language punctuated stories of life on the road. As the sun painted the sky in shades of red and gold, Trey made his way to the camp. He found Bull standing beside his Harley, running a cloth over its chrome with practiced care. The older man's face held a hint of a smile as he watched Trey approach. "You gave me $20, son," Bull said, tucking the cloth into his back pocket. "Now watch what I do with it." His eyes reflected the setting sun, filled with purpose, and something that looked remarkably like hope. Around them, bikers moved with newfound energy, as if Bull's words had set something significant in motion. The rumble of motorcycles provided a steady backdrop to their conversation, like distant thunder promising rain. But instead of bringing storms, these riders seemed ready to shower the town with their own brand of blessing, whether the townspeople were ready for it or not. The next morning dawned bright and crisp. The sound of hammering echoed through the quiet neighborhood as Bull and his crew descended on the Johnsons' worn-down porch. Their leather vests lay draped over motorcycle seats as they worked in t-shirts, sweat already beading on their foreheads. "Hand me that level, would you?" Bull called to Trey, who eagerly passed tools back and forth. The old boards came up easily, rotted through from years of rain. Mrs. Johnson watched from her window, a mix of gratitude and worry crossing her face. Across town, the bikers split into groups. Some headed to the church with paint buckets and brushes, while others unloaded boxes of food from their saddlebags at the local food pantry. The sight of rough-looking men doing gentle work drew stares from passing cars. At the high school, Trey couldn't focus on his algebra. Whispers followed him through the hallways. "I heard they're using his mom's house to store drugs," a girl muttered to her friend. "My dad says it's all for show," another voice carried across the cafeteria. "Some kind of PR stunt to make their gang look good." Trey kept his head down, pushing his food around his plate. The words stung, but he thought of Bull's weathered hands carefully measuring boards for his mother's porch, and his resolve strengthened. After school, Trey headed straight to the church. Bull was there, meticulously painting the peeling fence white. Without a word, Trey picked up a brush and joined him. "You don't have to do this," Bull said, after a while, his voice gruff with emotion. "These people, they're not being kind to you." "Mama says kindness isn't about what you get back," Trey replied, carefully coating another picket. "It's about what you give." Bull was quiet for a long moment, his brush strokes slowing. "Had a son once," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jamie. Joined the army right out of high school. We had a fight before he shipped out. Stupid thing about his mother, my ex-wife. Never got to make it right." Trey's brush stilled as Bull continued. "He died in Afghanistan, 7 years ago now." Bull's hand trembled slightly as he dipped his brush. "You remind me of him sometimes. Same quiet way of doing what's right, no matter what anyone says." The weight of Bull's loss hung heavy in the autumn air. Trey felt his heart squeeze with empathy for this tough man's hidden pain. "I'm sorry," he said softly, meaning it with every fiber of his being. They worked in companionable silence until Pastor Barrett appeared, his aged face creased in a gentle smile. "The steps could use some attention too," he suggested, gesturing to the church's worn entrance. Bull nodded, already reaching for more paint. The pastor watched them work for a moment before speaking again. "We'd love to have you join us this Sunday," he said to Bull. "All of you." Bull's laugh was short and harsh. "Been a long time since I darkened a church door, Pastor. Not sure your congregation would appreciate my kind in their pews." "Christ didn't turn away anyone," Pastor Barrett replied quietly. "Neither do we." Bull didn't respond, but something flickered across his face. Consideration, perhaps, or long-buried memories of Sunday mornings from his own youth. As evening approached, Trey helped clean up the paint supplies. His clothes were spattered with white, but the fence and steps gleamed in the setting sun. More bikers had joined throughout the day, and now the church grounds looked better than they had in years. Later that night, Trey lay in his narrow bed, listening to the low rumble of motorcycles from the camp outside town. The sound was both comforting and concerning, like thunder that could either bring life-giving rain or destructive storms. He thought about Bull's lost son, about the cruel whispers at school, about the way his mother's face lit up when she saw her new porch. The ceiling fan spun lazily above him, casting shifting shadows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at the unfamiliar nighttime sounds. Trey's mind wandered through the events of the past few days, trying to make sense of this strange brotherhood that had descended upon their quiet town. Were they truly a blessing, as his mother believed? Or were they, as the sheriff warned, trouble waiting to happen? He rolled onto his side, watching moonlight filter through his window. The steady hum of motorcycles continued, a constant reminder of change, whether the town was ready for it or not. As autumn deepened, the small Arkansas town witnessed a transformation. The bikers, led by Bull, turned their rough hands to gentle work day after day. The rumble of motorcycles became as familiar as birdsong, and with each sunrise brought new acts of kindness that left the townspeople struggling to hold on to their suspicions. At the high school, the old roof that had leaked for 3 seasons straight got a complete overhaul. Bull and 20 of his crew spent 2 full days up there, laying new shingles under the November sun. Students watched from below as tattooed arms wielded hammers and passed materials along the line. Over at May's Diner, the faded paint job that had been peeling for years received a fresh coat of cheerful yellow. The bikers worked through their lunch break, refusing payment except for coffee and conversation. May herself stood in her doorway, wiping tears from her eyes as she watched her little restaurant come back to life. The local newspaper ran a front-page story titled, "Young Samaritan Sparks Wave of Community Service." The article praised Trey's initial act of kindness and how it had sparked an unprecedented movement of goodwill. But online, the comments told a different story. "These thugs are just trying to clean up their image," one person wrote. "That Johnson kid's probably being used by these criminals," posted another. Trey tried not to read the comments, but they had a way of finding him anyway, whispered in hallways or glowing on phone screens held up for him to see. One crisp morning, as frost still clung to the grass, Bull approached Trey with something folded in his hands. It was a denim vest, clean and new, with a single patch sewn onto the back. "Kindness Crew," it read in simple letters against a white background. "Made it myself," Bull said gruffly, looking somewhere over Trey's shoulder. "Thought you should have one, being the one who started all this." Trey ran his fingers over the stitching, throat tight with emotion. He slipped it on right there, the denim still stiff and fresh. The next day at school, he wore it proudly. The sneers were immediate. "Look who joined the gang," someone called out. "Better watch out, he might kill you with kindness." Another voice echoed down the hallway, followed by laughter. But Trey kept the vest on, straightening his shoulders every time he caught his reflection. He remembered Bull's words about his son, Jamie, about doing what was right no matter what anyone said. The food drive was Bull's idea, but he insisted on putting Trey's name on all the flyers. "Small acts, big changes, the Trey Johnson food drive," they read. Bikers stationed themselves outside the grocery store, their massive bikes parked in neat rows, accepting donations from hesitant shoppers who soon found themselves charmed by the polite, rough-looking men. At home, Mrs. Johnson's cough grew worse with the changing weather. One evening, Trey returned from his shift at the gas station to find Bull sitting with his mother at the kitchen table, demonstrating something with his hands. "Now remember," Bull was saying, "breathe in through your nose for 4 counts, then purse your lips like you're blowing out a candle, real slow-like. Learned this in my medic days. Works wonders for the lungs." Mrs. Johnson followed his instructions, her breathing evening out. Color returned to her cheeks as she managed several clear breaths. "Where did you serve?" she asked between practiced breaths. "Army. 2 tours in Desert Storm," Bull replied, his voice softer than Trey had ever heard it. "Saw enough suffering to last several lifetimes, but also learned how to ease it a bit." They insisted Bull stay for supper. Mrs. Johnson had made her chicken and dumplings, stretching the meal to feed 3 instead of 2. The kitchen filled with warmth and conversation, punctuated by genuine laughter. Bull told stories about his travels, carefully edited for his audience. Mrs. Johnson shared tales of Trey as a little boy, making him blush and protest while Bull chuckled deeply. For a moment, it felt like family. The kind of family Trey had seen in other homes but never quite known in his own. Later that night, after Bull had said his goodbyes, Trey knelt beside his bed as he did every evening. The moonlight streamed through his window, casting a gentle glow on his clasped hands. "Dear God," he whispered, "thank you for sending Bull and his friends to help us. And please, please help Bull find his way to you. He's a good man, Lord. He just needs to know you see that too." Outside on the porch, where he had returned to check on Mrs. Johnson's breathing one last time, Bull stood frozen. The boy's earnest prayer carried clearly through the thin walls. Something wet slid down his weathered cheek, disappearing into his beard. He lifted his rough hands to his face, shoulders shaking silently in the darkness. The night was quiet, except for the distant sound of crickets and the occasional rumble of motorcycles from the campsite. Bull remained there for a long moment, his large frame silhouetted against the porch light, while inside, Trey continued his innocent prayer for the soul of a man who was already beginning to change. The weekend arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that seemed heaven-sent. Bull had spent days organizing what he called the Great Community Come-Together Barbecue, though most folks just called it the barbecue. Flyers appeared all over town. Free food, live music, and good company. Everyone welcome. Early Saturday morning, the town square transformed. Bikers set up long tables, strung lights between trees, and wheeled in massive grills. The smell of wood smoke filled the air as Bull supervised the setup, his voice carrying across the square. "Those tables need to be where the elderly can reach 'em easy," he directed, "and make sure we got plenty of chairs." Trey arrived early to help, wearing his Kindness Crew vest proudly. He watched as the first few townspeople trickled in, standing awkwardly at the edges, drawn by curiosity but held back by uncertainty. The sight of 300 bikers setting up a community event was something none of them had seen before. "Here," Bull handed Trey a huge pitcher of sweet tea. "Why don't you offer some to Miss Martha over there? She's been eyeing us like we might grow horns any minute." Trey approached the elderly woman with a gentle smile. "Would you like some tea, Miss Martha? My mama's recipe." Her weathered face softened at the mention of his mother. "Well, if it's Lorraine's recipe." She accepted the glass, took a sip, and nodded approvingly. "Just like my grandmother used to make it." The ice was broken. More locals began to drift in as the afternoon progressed. The aroma of Bull's famous ribs drew people like a magnet. He stood at the grill, sleeves rolled up to reveal his tattoos, expertly brushing sauce on rack after rack of ribs. "Secret's in the timing," he told anyone who asked. "Just like life, you can't rush what needs time to get tender." Reporter Jenna Cross arrived with her camera crew, but instead of looking for controversy, she found herself captured by the scene's warmth. Her camera panned across tables where bikers sat next to bank tellers, where mechanics shared cornbread with teachers, where children played tag between the legs of both locals and visitors. Mrs. Johnson arrived supported by two of Bull's most intimidating-looking riders, who treated her like fine china. They helped her to a comfortable chair in the shade, bringing her plates of food and keeping her water glass full. Though pale, she beamed at the sight of so many people coming together. As the sun began its descent, Bull called for everyone's attention. He stood on a makeshift platform, his massive frame backlit by the setting sun. "I want to thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying across the now quiet square. "But mostly, I want to thank one person. Trey Johnson, come on up here, son." Trey's face flushed red as he made his way forward. Bull placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "This young man right here," Bull continued, his voice rough with emotion. "He did something simple. He paid for a stranger's gas, $20, that's all it was. But that $20, it lit a fire in 300 hearts. It reminded us that kindness isn't weak. It's the strongest force there is." He raised his plastic cup. "To Trey Johnson, who showed us that change doesn't need millions of dollars or fancy programs. Sometimes it just needs one person brave enough to be kind. To Trey, the crowd echoed, and even the most skeptical locals joined in the toast. Mrs. Johnson dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. When Trey returned to her side, she pulled him close. "You did good, baby," she whispered. "You did real good." As darkness fell, someone started a bonfire. Local musicians who had brought their guitars began to play, their music mixing with the sound of laughter and conversation. Children roasted marshmallows while their parents swapped stories with bikers about everything from fishing spots to favorite recipes. In the midst of the celebration, Bull quietly slipped away. He walked through the darkness to the Johnsons' house, an envelope thick with cash in his hand. Without ceremony, he dropped it into their mailbox. No name, no note, just help where it was needed most. When he returned to the party, the bonfire was crackling high, sending sparks up to dance with the stars. The music had grown softer, more contemplative. Trey sat with his mother, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the flames. Around them, bikers and townspeople continued to mingle, their shadows blending together in the firelight. The night air carried the sweet scent of cooling barbecue and wood smoke, but it carried something else too. Hope, rising higher than the smoke, warming hearts more surely than any fire could. The embers of the community barbecue had long since cooled, and a peaceful quiet settled over the small Arkansas town. Most residents had drifted off to sleep, their hearts still warm from the day's unexpected unity. But in the shadows behind the Johnson house, a dark figure moved with purpose. The sound of breaking glass shattered the night's tranquility. Flames erupted inside the old wooden shed, casting an orange glow against weathered walls. The fire spread quickly, hungry for dry timber and old papers. Mrs. Johnson's screams pierced the darkness. "Trey, the shed's on fire!" Trey bolted awake, his heart pounding. The acrid smell of smoke filled his nostrils as he rushed from his bed, nearly tripping over his own feet. He burst through the back door in his pajamas, grabbing the garden hose that lay coiled against the house. "Call 911, he shouted to his mother, who stood trembling in her nightgown at the door. Water sprayed from the hose in an arc, but the flames seemed to laugh at his efforts. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he fought against the growing blaze. The heat pushed him back, making his eyes water. The rumble of motorcycles cut through the crackling fire. Bull led the charge, having spotted the flames from their campsite. Within moments, a dozen bikers surrounded the shed, stomping out scattered embers and helping Trey battle the flames. "Get that side!" Bull shouted, using his leather jacket to smother a patch of fire that had spread to the grass. Other bikers formed a bucket brigade, passing water from the house to throw on the flames. As the fire slowly died under their combined efforts, Trey noticed something that made his stomach turn. There, on the white fence that Bull and his crew had so carefully painted just days ago, ugly words glowed in the firelight. Crude slurs and "Get out" marked the wood in dripping red spray paint. Sheriff Lacey's cruiser pulled up, lights flashing. He emerged with his hand on his holster, surveying the scene with suspicious eyes. "What kind of trouble you boys stirring up now?" he demanded, directing his words at Bull. Bull's face contorted with rage. He stepped toward the sheriff, his massive frame tensed like a coiled spring. "You think we did this? To the boy who helped us?" "Bull, please," Trey called out, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Don't make it worse." The sheriff's radio crackled with reports of concerned citizens calling about biker violence. Trey could see the satisfaction in Lacey's eyes as he spoke into his shoulder mic. "Situation under control. Multiple suspects on scene." "Suspects?" Bull's voice thundered. "We're putting out the fire your good citizens started." Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her thin frame shaking but her voice steady. "Sheriff Lacey, these men have shown nothing but kindness to us. They came to help, not harm." The sheriff's lip curled slightly. Ma'am, with all due respect, you're being naive. These types always bring trouble. Dawn began to paint the sky in pale shades of pink and gray as more townspeople gathered to whisper and point. Trey could hear their murmurs. Those bikers finally showed their true colors. And what did they expect, inviting trouble like that? At school later that morning, exhausted and smelling of smoke, Trey faced a gauntlet of taunts. "Hey, Johnson, your biker buddies having a barbecue at your place too?" "Heard they tried to burn down your shed. Guess they didn't like your hospitality after all." Trey kept his head down, but each word struck like a physical blow. During lunch, he sat alone, pushing food around his plate without eating. The kindness crew patch on his vest, which had filled him with pride just yesterday, now felt like a target on his back. After classes ended, he walked to the remains of the shed. The morning's chaos had left behind a mess of charred wood, water-soaked ashes, and the acrid smell of burnt memories. Family photos they'd stored there were now nothing but curled, blackened fragments. Trey picked up a piece of burnt wood, its surface still warm. His throat tightened as he whispered words that tasted like ashes in his mouth. "What good's kindness if it gets you burned?" The red spray paint on the fence seemed to mock him, a cruel answer to his question. He touched the still wet paint, and it stained his fingers like blood, a stark reminder that sometimes no amount of goodwill could overcome hatred's deep roots. 2 days after the fire, storm clouds gathered over the small Arkansas town, matching the dark mood that had settled over its streets. Trey walked to work with his shoulders hunched, the weight of recent events pressing down on him like a physical burden. The confrontation happened outside Wilson's hardware store. Trey wasn't there to see it start, but he heard the commotion from the gas station. Matt Henderson, the councilman's son, was shouting at Bull, his face red with anger. "You and your gang think you can come here and play hero?" Matt's words carried across the street. "This is our town." Bull stood quietly, his weathered face set in stone. But when Matt shoved him, something snapped. In a flash, Bull had Matt pinned against the wall, not hitting him, just holding him there. "I know what you did," Bull growled. "I saw you that night, running from the Johnson place." A crowd gathered quickly. Sheriff Lacey arrived with 2 deputies, their hands already on their weapons. "Step away from him, Bull," Lacey ordered. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Matt broke free and stumbled, dramatically falling to the ground. "He attacked me," he shouted, "just like they attacked the Johnson place." 3 witnesses, all friends of the Henderson family, stepped forward immediately. They all told the same story. Bull had started it, had threatened Matt, had struck first. Their lies flowed smooth as honey, practiced and perfect. Bull didn't resist when they cuffed him. He just looked at Matt with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Coward," he said softly. "Can't even own up to your own fire." The news spread through town like wildfire. By sunset, the bikers who had brought so much change began to disappear. They packed up their tents, kicked their engines to life, and rolled out one by one. Some stopped by the gas station to say goodbye to Trey, their faces heavy with regret. "Can't risk staying, kid," one gruff-voiced rider explained. "They'll find a reason to lock us all up." Trey waited until after his shift to visit the jail. The holding cell was small, making Bull look even larger than usual. His tattoos seemed darker against the institutional white walls. "They're lying," Trey said, his voice cracking. "We can fight this. I'll tell them what I saw that night, the shadow running away." Bull's laugh was gentle, almost tender. "You'd be going up against the councilman's son, kid. Your word against his, and in this town, we both know how that ends." "But it's not right!" Trey's fists clenched at his sides. "After everything you did for us, For the town. Listen to me, Trey. Bull moved closer to the bars, his voice low and serious. You already saved me, kid. That day at the gas station, I was at rock bottom. Lost my son, lost my way. Then this skinny kid gives his last $20 to help a stranger. He smiled, and for a moment, the hard lines in his face softened. You showed me there's still good in the world. That's worth more than freedom to me. Trey wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. What am I supposed to do now? Keep being you, Bull said simply. That's more than enough. The days that followed felt hollow. The town settled back into its old rhythms, but something vital had been lost. The freshly painted church fence stood as a lonely reminder of what could have been. The repaired school roof leaked again, with no one willing to climb up and fix it. Trey threw himself into work, picking up every extra shift he could. His mother's condition worsened daily, her coughs echoing through their small house. The medical bills piled up, and without Bull's secret envelope of cash, they were drowning again. Every morning, Trey walked past the blackened shed on his way to work. The spray-painted slurs had been covered with fresh paint, but he could still see them in his mind. The silence of the mornings was deafening. No more rumbling engines, no more rough laughter, no more hope carried on the wind. At night, he sat beside his mother's bed, listening to her labored breathing. The house felt too big, too empty. Sometimes in the distance, he thought he heard the growl of motorcycles, but it was just his imagination playing tricks. I miss them too, his mother whispered one night, her thin hand finding his in the darkness. They brought life back to this place. Trey squeezed her hand gently, feeling the fragile bones beneath her skin. The steady rhythm of her shallow breathing was the only sound in the quiet house, a reminder of how precarious their situation had become. The memory of distant engines haunted him, like a song cut short before its final verse. Winter came early to Arkansas that year, dusting the town in a pristine white that couldn't quite hide its troubles. The first snow fell just before Thanksgiving, covering the charred remains of the Johnsons' shed like nature's bandage over an ugly wound. Trey spent his days working double shifts at the gas station, coming home only to tend to his mother, whose cough had gotten worse with the cold. The medical bills kept mounting, and without Bull's support, they were barely keeping their heads above water. One crisp December morning, Trey found himself on the porch steps, his worn work jacket pulled tight against the biting wind. The sky stretched endless and gray above him, like a blank page waiting for answers. His knees pressed against the wooden steps where Bull had sat just weeks ago, telling stories and sharing dreams. I did what you said, Lord, he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. His voice cracked with emotion. I showed kindness. I tried to help, but everything fell apart. The words felt heavy in his throat. Was I wrong? Did I make things worse? The wind whistled through the burnt remains of the shed, carrying the ghost of smoke and accusations. Trey closed his eyes, remembering the warmth of community that had briefly flourished here, the laughter at the barbecue, the sense of purpose as they worked together, the hope that had burned so bright before being snuffed out. His prayers fell into the silence, met only by the soft crunch of snow beneath his feet. The town had grown colder in more ways than one since Bull's arrest. People crossed the street when they saw him coming, as if kindness itself had become contagious. Then, cutting through his thoughts like a knife through butter, came a sound. Distant at first, but growing closer, the distinctive rumble of a motorcycle engine. Trey's heart leaped into his throat. He knew that sound, knew the particular rhythm of that engine. A single rider appeared at the end of their street, the motorcycle's chrome gleaming despite the overcast sky. Bull sat tall in the saddle, his familiar figure a sight that brought tears to Trey's eyes before he could stop them. The bike rolled to a stop in front of the house, and Bull killed the engine. He looked thinner, his leather jacket hanging a bit loose on his frame, but his eyes sparkled with the same warmth Trey remembered. A smile spread across his weathered face as he dismounted. "You didn't think I'd miss Christmas, did you?" Bull's voice was gruff with emotion. Trey practically flew down the steps, throwing his arms around the older man. They embraced tightly, neither ashamed of the tears that flowed freely. Bull's leather jacket was cold from the ride, but his hug was as warm as ever. "But how?" Trey managed to ask, pulling back to look at his friend. "They said you'd be in there for months." Bull's expression turned serious. "Truth has a way of coming out, son. That councilman's boy, Matt Henderson, he couldn't live with the guilt. Seems our little story went viral online. People across the country were asking questions, sharing videos from the barbecue, talking about what happened here." He shook his head in wonder. "Matt saw it all. Saw how people were calling him out. Saw the security camera footage some folks dug up. He broke down and confessed everything." Trey's eyes widened. "He admitted to the fire?" "Everything," Bull confirmed. "The fire, the lies about our fight, all of it. His daddy couldn't sweep it under the rug this time. Too many eyes watching." They moved to the porch steps, sitting in their old spots. Bull pulled out a thick stack of letters from inside his jacket. "But that's not all I came to tell you," he continued, his voice soft with pride. "I had a lot of time to think in that cell. Started writing letters. To every biker I've ever known. Every chapter across the country. Told them about you, Trey. About your faith, your kindness. How you changed not just my life, but this whole town, even if it was just for a little while." The letters rustled in his hands like autumn leaves. And they all answered, every single one. "You see, what happened here? It wasn't the end of something. It was just the beginning." Trey stared at the letters, each envelope bearing different postmarks from across the country. His vision blurred with fresh tears, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. For the first time in weeks, he felt the spark of hope rekindling in his chest. In the distance, the old church bell rang, its clear tone carrying across the snow-covered town. The same bell that had chimed the day Trey first helped Bull now seemed to herald something new, a reminder that kindness, like the seasons, moves in cycles, and that even the coldest winter eventually gives way to spring. Dawn broke over the small Arkansas town with the rumble of thunder, not from storm, clouds, but from hundreds of motorcycles descending the hill like an avalanche of chrome and leather. The morning sun caught their polished bikes, creating a river of light flowing down Main Street. Trey Johnson stood on his front porch, rubbing sleep from his eyes, hardly daring to believe what he was seeing. 300 bikers, maybe more, rolled into town in perfect formation. Behind them, a convoy of trucks and vans followed, their sides emblazoned with news station logos from across the state. "Lord have mercy," Mrs. Johnson whispered from her wheelchair, her thin hands clasped together. They really came back. The procession stretched for blocks, the sound of engines echoing off storefronts and church steeples. Townspeople emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some looked worried, others curious, but all watched in amazement as the bikers began to park in neat rows along the town square. Bull led them, his bike at the front of the pack. He looked different now, proud but humble, strong but gentle. The morning light caught the silver in his beard as he dismounted, turning to help his fellow riders unload their cargo. From the trucks and trailers came a steady stream of supplies, stacks of lumber, boxes of food, medical equipment still in its packaging. The bikers worked with military precision, creating organized piles in the town square. Some carried envelopes thick with donations, while others shouldered tool belts and construction equipment. Sheriff Lacey's cruiser pulled up, lights flashing but sirens silent. He stepped out slowly, hand resting near his hip, uncertainty written across his face. The crowd held its breath, remembering the tensions of weeks past. Bull walked toward him, steady and deliberate. The morning sun cast long shadows between them as they faced each other in the square. Then Bull did something that made the crowd gasp. He extended his hand. "We're not here to fight, Sheriff," Bull said, his voice carrying across the hushed square. "We're here to serve." For a long moment, Sheriff Lacey stared at the offered hand. Then, slowly, he reached out and shook it. The tension in the air dissolved like morning mist. "Never seen anything like this," the sheriff admitted, looking around at the organized chaos of supplies and volunteers. "Neither have I," Bull replied with a small smile, "but a 17-year-old boy taught me it's never too late to start something good." The news crews swarmed, cameras rolling as bikers began distributing supplies. Local reporters who had once written suspicious headlines now captured images of leather-clad men carrying boxes of food to elderly residents. National networks interviewed Bull about the viral story that had sparked this movement. At the Johnson house, work began immediately. A team of bikers, led by a man with licensed contractor patches on his vest, assessed the burnt shed. Others brought paint samples for Mrs. Johnson to choose from, treating her with the gentleness usually reserved for their own mothers. "Ma'am," one burly biker said, kneeling beside her wheelchair, "we noticed your porch steps are pretty steep. We've got some folks who specialize in wheelchair ramps. Would you allow us to install one for you?" Mrs. Johnson's eyes welled with tears as she nodded, unable to speak. The transformation was remarkable. The charred shed came down, and a new one rose in its place, stronger and larger than before. The house's faded paint gave way to fresh colors, chosen by Mrs. Johnson herself. The steep porch steps disappeared, replaced by a gently sloping ramp with sturdy handrails. Throughout the day, something even more remarkable happened. Townspeople who had once crossed the street to avoid the bikers now worked alongside them. The hardware store owner donated extra supplies. The diner sent over coffee and sandwiches. Children ran between the workers, offering water bottles and shy smiles. Trey moved through it all in a daze of gratitude. He helped where he could, but often found himself simply watching, overwhelmed by the generosity surrounding him. At one point, he found himself working beside Matthew Henderson, the councilman's son who had started the fire. The young man couldn't meet his eyes at first. "I'm sorry," Matthew said quietly, holding a paint roller. "For everything." Trey nodded, remembering Bull's words about truth and guilt. "Thank you for telling the truth in the end. That took courage." By afternoon, the transformation was complete. The Johnson house stood renewed, its fresh paint gleaming in the winter sun. The new shed looked solid enough to weather any storm. The wheelchair ramp curved gracefully to the ground, its rails painted to match the house trim. But it wasn't just the Johnson property that had changed. All across town, bikers were helping other families in need. Food pantries filled to bursting. Medical bills disappeared, paid by anonymous donors. Hope returned to faces that had long forgotten its warmth. Mrs. Johnson sat in her wheelchair at the top of her new ramp, watching it all with tears streaming down her face. Bull stood beside her, his weathered hand resting gently on her shoulder. Trey joined them, his heart too full for words. "Your boy's kindness," Bull said softly to Mrs. Johnson. "It started like a pebble in a pond. Now look at the waves it's made." They watched together as the community continued its work. Every hammer strike building not just structures, but bridges between people who had once stood divided. The old church bell rang out across the scene, its clear tone carrying a message of redemption and renewal. The late afternoon sun painted the town square golden as Bull stepped onto the makeshift platform in front of the old church. The crowd that gathered, a mix of leather-clad bikers and local townspeople, fell silent. Camera crews from 3 different networks adjusted their equipment, their red lights blinking in unison. Bull cleared his throat, his weathered hands gripping the wooden podium. "A month ago, I was just another broken man on the road," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed square. "My card got declined at a gas station, and a 17-year-old kid with barely anything to his name stepped up and paid my bill. $20. That's all it took to remind me what goodness looks like." The cameras panned to Trey, who stood near the front, supporting his mother in her wheelchair. His cheeks flushed at the attention, but he didn't look away. "That $20, Bull continued, emotion thick in his voice. "It turned into 300 hearts learning how to give again, and today we're taking that lesson nationwide." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Bull unveiled a large banner behind him. In bold letters it read, "The Kindness Ride, Cross-Country Compassion." "Starting next month," Bull announced, "we're launching the first annual Kindness Ride. 300 of us will ride coast to coast, stopping in towns just like this one, helping families just like the Johnsons. And we won't do it alone." He gestured to the row of people seated behind him, representatives from churches, veterans groups, and charitable organizations from across the country. Each stood as Bull introduced them, their presence a testament to how far the movement had spread. "We've already raised over $500,000, Bull revealed, triggering applause and gasps from the crowd. "But this isn't about money. It's about remembering that every act of kindness, no matter how small, creates ripples we can't even imagine." The cameras turned again to Trey as Bull called him forward. Mrs. Johnson squeezed her son's hand before letting him go, pride shining in her eyes despite her fatigue. "Trey Johnson," Bull said, his voice softening, "you're going to be our honorary first rider. Your $20 started this, and your heart will guide us forward." Bull held up a custom leather jacket, identical to the ones worn by his crew, but with a special patch that read, "Founder, the Kindness Ride." Trey's hands trembled as he accepted it, the leather smooth and heavy in his grasp. Reporters called out questions, their voices overlapping. "Trey, how does it feel to inspire a national movement? What made you help Bull that day? Did you ever imagine this would happen?" Trey stepped to the microphone, his voice quiet but steady. "I just did what my mama taught me," he said, looking back at his mother. "She always says kindness comes back. I guess she was right." Mrs. Johnson wiped tears from her cheeks, nodding at her son. "See, baby?" she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed square. "Kindness always comes back." The crowd erupted in applause as Bull embraced Trey, the cameras capturing the moment when the tough biker and the gentle teenager stood together, embodying the bridge their movement had built between different worlds. Throughout the rest of the afternoon, more announcements followed. Church leaders spoke about opening their doors to bikers and establishing support networks in their communities. Veterans groups pledged to join the ride, bringing their own resources and expertise. Local business owners stepped forward with donations and promises of support. The news crews interviewed person after person, each sharing their own story of how this movement had touched them. A grandmother told of bikers fixing her roof. A single father described how the food drive had helped him feed his children. A teenager admitted how seeing Trey's courage had inspired him to stand up to bullies at school. The raised funds would be managed by a newly established nonprofit, ensuring transparency and proper distribution. Plans were already in motion for the first ride, with mapped routes and designated stops in communities across America. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the church steps, Bull made one final announcement. "We're not just riding for show," he declared. "Every town we visit will receive help. Real, practical help. Home repairs, food assistance, medical bill support. And we're bringing more than just our own resources. We're bringing hope." The old church bell rang out, its clear tone seeming to affirm his words. Trey stood with his mother, both of them watching as their small act of kindness transformed into something bigger than they could have imagined. Mrs. Johnson's hand found her son's, squeezing it gently. The cameras captured it all. The tears, the smiles, the embraces between people who had once been strangers. In that moment, their little town in Arkansas became more than just a dot on the map. It became the birthplace of a movement that would touch countless lives across the nation. The Arkansas spring arrived with a burst of color, painting the Johnsons' yard with wild violets and yellow daisies. The worn house that had once seemed destined for foreclosure now stood proud, its fresh white paint gleaming in the morning sun. New wooden railings lined the porch where Mrs. Johnson often sat in her rocking chair, her breathing easier in the warm air, watching hummingbirds dart among the feeders Bull had hung for her. Inside, Trey adjusted his graduation gown, his fingers trembling slightly as he straightened the royal blue fabric. The mirror reflected back a young man who looked older than his 17 years, his eyes carrying wisdom earned through extraordinary times. "Let me help you with that," Mrs. Johnson said softly, reaching up to fix his collar. Her hands were steadier now, thanks to the new medication they could finally afford. "You look so handsome, baby." A familiar rumble of engines filled the air, growing louder until it seemed to shake the windows. Trey and his mother shared a knowing smile. Right on time. Outside, Bull led a procession of 50 bikers, their chrome gleaming in the morning light. They parked in a perfect line along the street, their leather swoosh, vests bearing the now famous Kindness Crew patches. Bull, his gray beard neatly trimmed for the occasion, climbed the porch steps with something hidden behind his back. "Got a graduation present for you, son," he said, revealing a brand new leather jacket. On the back, elaborate stitching spelled out, "Original Spark, Kindness Ride Founder." Trey's eyes welled up as Bull helped him into it. "It fits perfect over your gown," Bull said, his voice gruff with emotion. "You ready to make an entrance?" The graduation ceremony was being held at the high school football field, where hundreds of folding chairs faced a makeshift stage. As Trey's procession approached, the rumble of motorcycles drew every head. 50 bikes flanked his mother's car, which Bull drove carefully while Mrs. Johnson sat in the passenger seat, beaming with pride. Trey rode on the back of the lead bike, driven by one of Bull's most trusted brothers. The sight was no longer shocking to the townspeople. Instead, faces lit up with recognition and welcome. Children waved excitedly at the bikers, who had become local heroes through their continued community service. Sheriff Lacey stood at the field entrance, his badge catching the sunlight. His transformation over the months had been remarkable. The man who had once viewed the bikers with suspicion now greeted them with genuine warmth. "Trey," the sheriff called out, holding something small in his palm. "The town council wanted me to present this to you." It was a silver medal, inscribed with the words, "For outstanding community service." The sheriff pinned it carefully to Trey's gown, then stepped back and offered a crisp salute. "You taught us all something important, son. Thank you." The ceremony itself was filled with moments that would have seemed impossible months ago. When Trey's name was called, the bikers revved their engines in a thunderous salute, but they weren't alone. The whole crowd stood, applauding the young man who had changed their town's heart. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the church grounds. The old building looked better than it had in decades, its walls freshly painted, its garden blooming with spring flowers. The smell of barbecue filled the air as Bull and his crew manned several giant grills, serving up ribs and chicken to a long line of hungry graduates and families. Mrs. Johnson sat at a table of honor, surrounded by a mix of church ladies and leather-clad bikers, all of them sharing stories and laughter. The barriers that had once divided their community had melted away, replaced by genuine friendship. As the afternoon sun began to soften, Bull called everyone's attention to the church wall. A cloth covered something near the entrance. "We've got one more surprise," he announced, nodding to Trey to help him unveil it. Together they pulled away the cloth to reveal a bronze plaque mounted on the wall. The gathered crowd fell silent as they read the words. In honor of Trey Johnson. Proof that kindness always comes back. Trey stood speechless, his hand resting on the warm bronze. The plaque would remain there for generations, telling the story of how one small act of kindness had sparked a nationwide movement. "That's not all," Bull said, his eyes twinkling. "Think it's about time for your first real ride, don't you?" Trey looked questioningly at his mother, who nodded her approval. "Go on, baby. I'll be right here watching." Bull's Harley-Davidson gleamed in the golden evening light, its engine rumbling like distant thunder as he started it up. Trey climbed on behind him, his heart racing with excitement. The leather of his new jacket creaked as he gripped Bull's shoulders. "Hold on tight, son," Bull called over his shoulder. "This is just the beginning." They pulled away from the church, followed by a parade of bikes. Mrs. Johnson stood on the church steps, waving as her son disappeared down the highway. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, and the rumble of engines echoed off the hills like music. Trey felt the wind in his hair and watched the familiar landscape of his town roll by. He thought about that gray November day when he'd given $20 to a stranger, never imagining how that simple act would ripple outward, touching countless lives. The Kindness Ride was now a movement spanning all 50 states, with chapters forming in other countries. But more than that, it had transformed their own small corner of Arkansas. The town that had once viewed strangers with suspicion now opened its arms to travelers. The church that had stood quiet and fading now buzzed with activity and hope. And a boy who had once felt powerless against poverty and prejudice had discovered that kindness was the strongest force of all. As they cruised down the highway, Trey could see their shadows stretching long beside them, like fingers reaching toward tomorrow. Bull's voice carried back to him on the wind. "Ready to see what's over that horizon?" Trey nodded, knowing that whatever lay ahead, he would face it with the strength of family, both the one he was born to and the one he had helped create. His mother's words echoed in his mind, proven true in ways he never could have imagined. Kindness always comes back. The engines roared as they rode into the sunset, their combined thunder a testament to how one small spark of compassion could ignite a flame bright enough to light up the darkest night. The highway stretched before them like a promise, leading toward a future where kindness wasn't just a hope, it was a way of life. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.